I would like to begin with lines from James Merrill's poem Lost in Translation, partly because the poem is dedicated to Richard Howard, and mostly because it seems very much in the spirit of the Italian Poetry Review. It's written in English, but the poem moves between three languages, interlacing the story of a boy's missing puzzle piece with the lost German translation of a French poem. Merrill doubts his memory as to whether the translation even exists. Then he concludes that it does, because he can picture the shape of the poem in his mind. I think immediately of the Italian Poetry Review's aims and impact as a multilingual journal, as Merrill conjures a German translation by Rilke of a French poem by Valéry. He describes how the owlet umlaut peeps and hoots above the open vowel, and after rain, a deep reverberation fills with stars. Lost, is it? Buried? One more missing piece? But nothing's lost, or else all is translation, and every bit of us is lost in it. In the pages of the IPR, as with Merrill's poem, we're asked to savor negative capability, a poem's existence as both one thing and another, while still carefully studying the sounds and the forms in each. Reading through Mark Strand's poems alongside their Italian counterparts, exploring three different versions of a poem by Andrea Zanzotto, and reading translations of poems that Edith Bruck wrote in a language which for her is itself a translation, I felt welcomed into a kind of community, where the versions address rather than contest each other and use translation as a dialogical tool. To my mind, translation is at its best a community. I see the 5 different versions of Mandelstam's selected poems on my bookshelf as imperfect, brilliant, and quarrelsome friends. The very impulse to translate, manifested so elegantly in this journal, suggests a notion in which poets have long taken refuge, that there is no definitive version of a poem, but rather each translation makes the space for what's possible a little larger, involving and expanding not just the community of readers and writers, but of readers as writers. And translation is always subject to the dynamics of that community space. Look, for example, at the word bufera, which, as Giuseppe Laporace mentions in his interview with Mark Strand, takes the place of blizzard in the Italian title of Strand's book Blizzard of One, from which we just heard gorgeous poems. Its sound is a fat, friendly cloud to the serrated knife edge of the word blizzard. And furthermore, it brings to the translated book a precursory context of Montale, whose 1956 book claimed the same word with its title, La bufera e altro. And we can hear how the simple primary colored building blocks of the music in Strand's poetry blur to a kind of watercolor in Laporace's Italian versions, like paintings by Diebenkorn metamorphosing into Kandinsky. Strand's villanelles lose their rhyme schemes, and the original's neat rectangle begins to come unwoven, as if half-finished, an opening up of the closed story into its next, improbably infinite versions. Perhaps that's what I most appreciate in IPR, that opening up, or as Robert Lowell said, and Simon West quotes in his article on Andrea Zanzotto, the invitation to be reckless with literal meaning. This recklessness is imagination's imperative, but it is also the critic's nemesis, which Eliot, as West recounts, warned Robert Lowell to avoid. And West wonders if we have moved on and no longer need fear Eliot's meticulous little critics, though he himself then meticulously criticizes 2 versions of the poem La perfezione della neve by Andrea Zanzotto in favor of his own. And I found myself mostly seduced by West's version, with his passion for Zanzotto's giddy sound, but I also disagreed with small choices, a particular word, a creative verb translation. These disagreements seemed to make the original that much more mine. West's resistance to the previous versions speak with and not to them, in a way that recent back pages of Poetry magazine, with their accusations of sexism, imperialism, and just plain unforgivable ignorance in the debate over Marilyn Chin's translations of an 18th century Vietnamese poet, did not. But I read those pages in Poetry avidly, admittedly more as a blood sport spectator than as a poet. And I feel grateful to any debate over translation, whatever its form. I think we do still need fear, Eliot's meticulous critics. And more than that, I think that our fear is fruitful. It's another face on the longing to know gold as gold and oro as oro, to believe that the word for a thing can hold its meaning. Because it's only when we ask it to do so, it's only in reacting to the critics in Poetry's back pages or in our own impulse, that the excess of possibility in gold or oro trickles from the hand that holds a word's meaning to pool underneath it and make a larger space where communication happens, where meaning mingles and is exchanged. And with that, I want to go back to conclude with Simon West and his musing that fidelity may take so many forms in poetry, be it the naive fidelity of translating word for word, or those more complicated forms of fidelity which we know in life as well as poetry, and which almost inevitably dictate betrayals alongside. We are, after all, looking for clues when we look through poems, for secret trap doors into our lives, ways to hide and find ourselves in a particular line or stanza or poem. And we poets are also always looking for those portals between pieces of our lives, what connects an adolescent summer to the glass hummingbird on a Christmas tree, why the month of October is to be associated with bees. And for these portals, the IPR is like a house from a Borges story, mirror-paneled tunnels running between rooms. We are not only given Brett Foster's translations of 13th century poet Cecco Angiolieri that are as carnal and current as Kanye West lyrics. I do not think that I will forget that Cos'è si leggiadre can translate in English into bling. But we're giving them alongside the poetry of Mark Strand, each offered with equal accessibility, the tunnel between them invisible until it's presented to us, and then inevitable, as with the tunnels that this issue of the IPR illuminates between Sanguinetti and Ashbery, between Celan and Ungaretti, each contribution connecting poets, centuries, and cultures to the extent that all is translation, as Merrill supposed, and every bit of us is lost in it. Thank you.